of Climate Week. So thank you all and family and support. It's so wonderful to have a community here today. So actually, I know we were just standing, so I won't ask you to stand up, but just to bring back some energy with the Arcadia visuals, we've got burning fossil fuel infrastructure on the wall. So we've got the fire right now. So I just want to bring a little bit of fire and presence and awareness to this final session. And we are going to keep it relatively tight with the speakers so we can open it up to get your questions and have this to be more of a dialogue as well. So I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Cassia, and thank you to Sveta and the organizers for hosting this beautiful space. I'm on the board of a nonprofit, Oceanic Global, and we're an ocean conservation nonprofit, and we do a lot of work to tackle plastic and waste, primarily through a program we launched called the Blue Standard, which is a sustainability verification program. So we spend a lot of time with companies redesigning packaging and waste management infrastructure, but really more as from a consultant perspective. So we're here with some true experts in waste management infrastructure who have built systems, redesigned technology, and so I'm going to pass it over to them. And the title of our conversation is recycling a hoax? And so at the end, we're going to be getting your insights on that as well. So I'll just pass it to Stan and then you each just introduce yourselves and we'll get into the discussion.
Thank you, Cassia. Hi.
I don't know that thing is working.
Yeah, I don't know.
We can just talk. We can project our voices.
Okay, great.
Check. No, nothing?
Yes.
All right, I just have to hold my mouth real close to the mic. So.
Nice, okay.
So my name is Stan. I'm the CEO of RecycleGO. We are a supply chain visibility platform that is built on blockchain and uses AI to optimize supply chains. And one of our applications is the original product, which is a recycling blockchain. We are deployed in Lagos, Nigeria with a company called Recyclers that tracks their recycling activity. Like Nigeria, the Lagos River in Nigeria is actually one of the top 10 polluting rivers in the world in terms of plastics pollution. So I originally built and deployed the blockchain to really try to understand recycling, plastics, and to give that a blockchain chain of custody. We are going to be using that to basically use our platform to generate data, and the previous session really talked about data, right? And we're really looking at data as a way to unlock climate financing in terms of getting this money that is allocated for well, basically carbon offsets. Let's call it the voluntary carbon markets, getting that climate financing to these sustainable projects using verified data.
Cool. Can you hear me if I don't use the mic? Because I feel it's slightly distorting. Okay.
Speak louder.
Speak louder, even louder than. Is this good? There's my family over there, by the way. They're gonna heckle me probably. Don't heckle. But I'm Mimi Wu. I am founder of Global Green Solutions, which is consulting and advisory, but that's really built off of my previous company, which is called Myanmar Recycles. And with that, I set up industrial scale recycling and collection for used plastic bags, which is one of the hardest plastics in the world to recycle, which I didn't really realize until I set up my factory and then was like, oh my God, what the hell am I doing? And cried for 6 months, literally every single day for 6 months. But I did that in a place called Myanmar, which is in Southeast Asia. I'm not from there, I have no cultural ties, no family ties, so I was a complete foreigner, no entrepreneurial experience, no engineering experience, but just such a strong conviction that plastics is completely destroying our planet and there's something we can do about it. And that's very much built off of my previous life, doing international development and trying to save the world and improve healthcare systems. So impact has always been part of what I do. And right now, I've closed down that company because we had a military coup in Myanmar, so I lived through that. Came back to the US, came to New York to dance actually, so we can talk about that later. And I'm helping to build infrastructure solutions in the global south, working on policy solutions, just trying to bring attention to the plastic pollution issue, finance it, build infrastructure. That's my major thing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I don't think we're using this right. Thank you for that, Mimi. And actually, my first question is for you. So I'm
Yeah.
going to start with you. And as you mentioned, plastic bags are some of the hardest plastics to recycle. And just a show of hands, did everyone know that soft plastics in New York City are non-recyclable, right? So it's just the rigid plastics, 1, 2, or 5. And that's the case in most places across this country as well as the world. And so as you were going on this journey, I'd actually love to hear too about some of the inspirations for what took you on this journey, but then also some of the myths that you were debunking around plastic recycling as you explored this. And yeah, maybe unexpected challenges as you were going through that.
Yeah, that's a lot.
I know it's a lot. So debunking myths and unexpected challenges.
Yeah. Okay. I think just to set the scene of what Myanmar looks like. So in general, waste management, like a third of the world, basically like where we're living right now, has formal waste collection. So that means when you put your garbage out, there's somebody who is going to come and pick it up on a scheduled basis and take it to a formal site where they will manage it. But the rest of the world does not have that. So another third of the world does have collection, but very kind of on an irregular basis. So it's like, oh, they're supposed to come on Friday. Well, they didn't come until like 2 weeks later. And then the last third just like doesn't even have anything at all. So what people do is they burn their trash, literally take it out in the front yard and light it on fire, because I've been in those communities. They will take it and dump it into a riverway, because it's really easy to like throw it away and just be like, oh, it disappeared, it's fine now. Or they'll bury it on their land. And all these things I've experienced firsthand. And so that's one of the biggest challenges that I faced in Myanmar, that there's just no infrastructure. There's no collection, there's no garbage man, there's no place to formally dump waste. So, and this is happening, as I said, I guess 66% of the world kind of has this situation. So I was having to do the collection myself, I was having to do the sorting myself, I had to do the melting down myself, of which these things in a country like the US, that's like 3 or 4 different companies doing that. And I was having to do that as myself. So that was a major challenge. Another thing is with bags, as you mentioned, like one of the hardest plastics in the world to recycle, and because it's super thin. And what do we do with plastic bags when we get it? The second life is usually like our garbage bag, right? Like we'll get it, we'll put like kitchen grease or something. So for me to take that, literally I had people in the dump sites picking it for me. It's end of life, putting it through the machines to wash it, getting it to a really high quality is nearly impossible to do. So that's why I was one of the only companies managing post-consumer film. And that's not just for film, it's just in general, post-consumer, like plastics that we all take, throw away into the garbage bin. Super hard to kind of like collect and wash to a really high quality standard. And then I have like a few. A lot of it also, we don't think about this as consumers, but a lot of products are not designed for circularity. So we keep promoting like recycling and keep promoting circularity. But the thing is that the people who want to buy this stuff, the brands, they only want clear and white colored recycled content so that they can dye it their own personal brand of neon green or something. But the thing is, if you put neon green into the market, I'm having to collect that. I can't make neon green clear again. Like there is some technology too, but it's super expensive. It's not going to be happening in Lagos, Nigeria, in Myanmar, in like most of the global south. And then finally, so those are like the technical components, the infrastructure barriers, and then finally also there are a lot of economic barriers to the whole recycling industry. A lot of it is because there's unpredictability of the markets, right? So like it's the sales price is fluctuating up and down with the price of oil and gas. Plastics is set at like 70% of the price of like, we're really upset about this.
That oil and gas is like,
oh yeah, like, this is perfect. This is perfect timing. But like oil and gas, so like plastic is made from the byproduct of the petrochemical industry. So their inputs are zero, right? So the raw material is zero. It's really hard for recyclers to then compete, as we are having to pay, if you're collecting yourself, labor is kind of fixed. A lot of our costs are fixed. So super, super challenging. We're getting squeezed very, very much. And we can get into kind of the regulatory thing as well, but what did I want to say? Yeah, it's just not the price of virgin versus recycled. it's just not taking into account the true cost of how much it costs to produce it, extract it, whatever, manage and process it, and then also the cost on our human health, environment, etc. So yeah. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Eve. I know. We'll come back to you. That was a lot. And what I love too is that you made it super tangible, because I'm sure people have a variety of perspectives, also those tuning in online, and how much you know about plastics and recycling, but that was so tangible and direct in terms of how it needs to be processed and managed to turn into something new. And I think you mentioned something that's really important with recycling. Recycling is a business. So recycling only works when somebody else wants to buy the material, right? So if there's low value for the material, if nobody's going to buy it, you don't have a market, you don't have recycling. This is why it's also really challenging to recycle glass. Glass is made out of sand. It has very little to no value. So even though it's one of the materials that can be infinitely recycled, oftentimes it is not recycled. I grew up in Hong Kong, so we actually created our own community glass recycling project and grinding it down and turning that into construction materials. But that's not the highest secondary life or continuation of life for that material. So just underscoring the business model around recycling and why this is limited for thin film plastics. And with that, a lot of it, what you just shared with us is transparency, because you have vertical management of the supply chain, but most of the time we are lacking that transparency. And here in New York, you might have actually noticed, or anywhere that you live, when a truck shows up and puts both the recycling bin and the garbage bin into the same truck, or have you seen the recycling bins that have different cutouts, but underneath it's just one bin, right? So you're sorting, but it's not being sorted. So at every stage of sorting and separation, you need to have that continued intention. So on the note of transparency, I'd love to hear then from you, Stan, about the blockchain solution with RecycleGO, how you're addressing transparency, anything else you might want to add there.
Look, blockchain as a technology is basically, at the core is a shared ledger. So it's basically a permanent record of historical activity. So when you're doing something and you blockchain that activity, you're giving it, a GPS timestamp. All right, it's saying like, I did this at this point in time at this location. All right, and then you put it on the ledger, everybody shares that information, so it's like, okay, you can actually prove that activity. So that's in essence, the core of blockchain. Why does it matter actually? Because basically, like, when I developed and deployed my recycling blockchain, I was like, you know what? People do want to know where their recycling goes. People do want to buy things that have proven verified, like, recycled content. Hey, here it is. Blockchain is a solution. Here it proves that you have that full, audit trail that everybody can verify, giving that transparency to the activity. And when I deployed it, basically, look, in terms of transparency, it's basically about verified data. And what we can do with that data that provides value. And the issue of value is what we value as a society and what we value as consumers is not necessarily aligned with business value. All right, and it's like, okay, I deployed it, I said, in a meeting with Coca-Cola, right? And it's like, all right, here's the blockchain, here you go. Here's my solution. Okay, you can prove recycled content. They're like, okay, well, you know what? If my customers aren't asking for it, why should I pay for it? Right? So I had to go back to the drawing board, and it's like, okay, how can I prove value? Because as Mimi said, look, recycling is a business, all right? Recycling basically, if it is costing too much, recycling is not profitable. And for me as a recycler, I've actually been a recycler for 24 years at this point professionally. And it's like recycling, I view number one as what's called a labor arbitrage business. Yours, why are recyclables sent over to most of Asia to be processed and handled? It's because basically it costs too much in the US to recycle. The other issue is basically recycling is also I consider logistics as well. If it costs too much to transport from point A to point B, and the value of a recycled polymer, for example, is $150 a ton, right? Well, and it costs you, let's say, $90 a ton just to move it from point A to point B. Well, guess what? The reality is not profitable. So, really, blockchain, I pivoted to really look at the carbon savings that we can get, because now I have the audit trail. Now I can actually measure the emissions along the whole supply chain, and it's like, okay, there is a carbon savings. Well, that has a value. So my blockchain, but basically I've been pivoting over the last few years to really understand systems and how we can use data to provide value for activity, for sustainable activity. So it's a matter of like, okay, we can place evaluation and price discovery mechanisms around carbon savings, or we can place like, basically, or like, supply chain visibility, we can actually layer on weather data. Just announced a partnership yesterday actually with the quantum computing company to layer on predictive models. If you have visibility into supply chains, now you can actually predict supply chain disruptions. And that costs companies a lot of money. It's like, all right, how do we incentivize companies to do the right thing, right? 430 million tons of plastics being produced every year. And basically, we only have 38 million tons of capacity for recycling. That's it. So
Wow.
it's like, basically, I think it's like, 8% recycling rate for plastics every year. That's it. So until we change the incentivization mechanisms, until we allow data to incentivize companies to onboard capacity or do better, back to the title of this conversation, recycling will be a hoax.
Wait, sorry, I know you want to,
Please.
but like, I also want to point out the fact that there's so many virgin producer. Virgin is like the, I guess that's pretty self-explanatory.
Let's call it fossil based. Fossil.
Again, our fossil image comes
Yeah.
up.
Right.
I have a clicker in my hand and like.
Are you?
Oh,
No,
okay.
it's something-
It's like every time we
It's
speak.
not that it's
But I will say that there's so much virgin production coming online of plastics. Like, we are set to double, potentially even triple the amount of plastic production in the next 25 years. Okay, that's really frightening. And who's doing that? It's like all, that's one thing. Coupled with the recycling facilities that are coming online. Because actually there are a lot coming online in the US, Asia, Middle East over the next 2 years or so. But the people who are backing that on a very sizable investment level are the petrochemical companies, are the oil and gas companies. So they're perpetuating this idea that recycling is going to save us from the crisis, and that's really not the case because of the so many technical and economic barriers. Even if we solve all of those things, which we do have room to improve, it will not reach 100% recyclability. And so, yeah, I think that's just something that we have to keep in mind, because I think that there's actually an oversupply of material in the market right now, and they're only adding more on and diluting, really driving down the price, where recycling content cannot match it, be economical, just can't really survive, especially without regulation.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, actually on that note, and this might be outdated at this point, but just as we see a global shift, which is wonderful, from a fossil fuel based energy economy towards renewable energy sources, we're also seeing petrochemical companies and oil and gas companies investing more in the production of plastic to do something with that material, right? So 1 in every 8 gallons of oil is being turned into plastic. At least that was the case some years ago, so maybe it's even greater now. And so we're actually seeing more investment into new petrochemical facilities, as Mimi was just saying. So as we're having this conversation at a global level about the Global Plastics Treaty, regulating plastics, banning single-use plastics, reducing our consumption at the personal business levels, we're seeing a lot more investment. So that's where we're what we say we value does not match with the actions that industry is taking, and so there's a discontinuity there. And we also, I was going to mention, I want to loop back to policy, but for the next question is going to be about behavior change, because there has also been, alongside this myth of recycling, there's this myth that it's our fault, that we created this issue, that it's the consumers, it's the people who litter, and with organizations or efforts, at least in this country, Keep America Beautiful was actually funded by the plastics industry to create a narrative that we can clean this up. It needs to be us as individuals to clean this up, right? Or that it's our choice, it's up to us to recycle, and it's on us to be part of that solution, rather than the manufacturers, rather than the product designers or the infrastructure that's available. So just would like to hear, your thoughts on behavior change, how that plays a role in this conversation. Whoever will take it.
Well, adding on to that, so,
Yeah.
and also, yeah, thank you, Joseph, for reminding me of this in the morning, but like California just sued, the state of California just sued Exxon, which is the largest producer of polymers, so largest producer of plastics, right? And that's kind of a first, but they are suing them because they've had a decades-long campaign of saying that recycling is gonna save us from, or is gonna work, it works, it's gonna save us from the pollution crisis, etc. But they knew for all this time that that's not true at all, right? So that's a bit of a challenge, and they spend so many marketing dollars on making all of us believe that we are responsible for this crisis, that, you know, through our small little behavior change. I mean, we can make a difference, for sure. I think we should all be conscious consumers. I think all of us probably are, talking to an echo chamber here. But yeah, in terms of like how many billions of dollars are spent to say, what did BP do? They were like, did a campaign like, what are you doing? You know, for what part are you playing? And they had just had like a major oil spill. You know?
Look, I mean, when we're talking about behavior change, like, you know, I am so sorry.
Oh, I just don't. Not.
I am. This will be ignored. My apologies. When we're talking about behavior change, we really should change the behavior of people when they're speaking. They really need to turn off their phones. Now, look, you know, Climate Week, I do think like most of the people in this room understand, like, you know, let's call it proper behavior. And like behavior change, I think like comes from, part of it is going to be education and policy perspective, right? From what I see of the recycling industry and the lack of capacity, right? And the numbers are staggering in terms of only like, you know, 7-8% of the plastics being produced every year is essentially like recycled. So what do we have to do to shift that? It is going to have to come from a policy, a regulatory environment, because like our traditional business models are broken, right? You're pumping out all of this product, and you're thinking about basically your cost and your revenue model that completely disregards environmental externalities, the cost to the environment. And if you factor that in, all right, right now with the carbon markets, we're attempting to factor in the cost of carbon, right, into our models. And that's the right approach, even though everybody should understand that the cost of carbon is actually grossly undervalued in terms of the environmental damage that it's doing already. So plastics, how do we factor that in and basically use that as essentially like, you know, extended producer responsibility programs, anything to like, you know, when we're talking about recycling, how do we use that like, you know, environmental externality as a cost and put it into the business model so we can essentially like, you know, use it to finance like, you know, infrastructure projects to build out more capacity is the way I see a possible solution / like, you know, behavior change, but on the corporate side. All right, and this is what needs to shift, as in like, okay, like, you know, it costs, my research shows that basically the cost of environmental plastics can range anywhere between $3,000 and $33,000 per ton, all right, per ton. All right, the cost of cleanup is only maybe $100 per ton. So why wouldn't you basically add that into your cost in terms of like actually cleaning it up before it actually leaks into the environment? Put in infrastructure, allocate costs. It's like, oh, but it's too expensive. No, it's not. All right, the cost of the environment is actually too expensive. And we need that kind of behavior change. Thinking, like, you know, basically understanding that sustainability is actually profitable, not a cost center.
Yeah, nice. I love what you just spoke into the room, and tangibly some of the negative externalities that you mentioned earlier, maybe. So that's powerful. And on this note of policy, you mentioned EPR. EPR is extended producer responsibility, so putting accountability on the polluters, right? So it's a polluter pays concept, which could, depending on how the legislation is structured, that could just be collection for recycling as well, as you were saying earlier, Mimi. That's where the investment is going from some of these big manufacturers or product designers. as well. So we do have EPR legislation in New York State and Maine that is really setting the standard in this country at least, although I know there's more developed EPR legislation elsewhere. We also have the Global Plastics Treaty. I alluded to this earlier, but we're about to have the 5th convening of the International Negotiating Committee in Busan coming up in just a couple months. November, yeah.
November?
And so this has been an ongoing discussion. It has moved forward quite quickly in UN terms because it's in just a couple of years. But right now that treaty does not hold a lot of weight in the sense that they have taken out the pieces that are talking about stopping production or capping production, limiting the production of virgin plastics that, as Mimi was mentioning, are so harmful and a part of the fossil fuel infrastructure. Again, behind you. This is wonderful, Val, I have to say. So yeah, I would like to hear your thoughts on specific policy, if you have any specific thoughts on those pieces you'd like to share, or any other tools, because you've mentioned the need for regulation and how that will come into place.
I was actually like during COVID. They had the INC. Which number was it in Geneva? And I was.
That was 0 because the first one was in Uruguay.
Okay, so basically, I was at the first one essentially in Geneva. All right, I was the only private company there aside from Nestle. And I remember speaking to because it was the Trump administration, I remember speaking to the temporary ambassador. And he was like, I was like, you know what, are we gonna be able to get this done? Like in terms of plastics pollution? It's like, probably not. The US is probably not going to be able to enforce it. All right, because of how divided the U.S. is, especially because we've had so many years of oil companies really shifting the narrative around climate change. There is no climate change, right? This was a concerted effort by the oil industry to essentially put out a public message that would make sure their business model was not going to be undermined. All right. So he was like, all right, essentially any kind of, because we're signatory onto the Paris Agreement, right? All right, basically the Basel Accords was basically implementation of the the Paris Agreement. Basel Accords actually, we are not a signatory of the Basel Accords. We are not part, the US is not part of the Basel Accords, and you know why? Because basically the U.S. government understands that it cannot enforce it on the federal level here because the country is too divided. All right. So when we're talking about the plastics,
right.
All right, the U.S. might sign on to it. I think the current administration definitely wants to sign on to it, but it knows it can't enforce it because it can't pass any binding legislation and have it pass in this country.
But can I say one thing really quick? Because they did over the summer. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
They did, and also we can start taking public Q&A.
Yeah, exactly. This is the last one.
Yeah, sorry. But they actually, because the US hates ratifying anything that they have to be beholden to actually.
Yeah.
So they just don't. But they did come out with a very strong statement that said we support caps on virgin production, which is pretty huge. I mean, it's
that is huge.
I mean, yeah, that's at the peak level of being wow, this is a wrong industry to support, and we're gonna try to slow you down, So for them to come out and say that, it's it's pretty.
That is huge and a shift, and you're right, because they have not been a supportive voice in those negotiations prior because of all.
Well, they didn't even take a stance, to be honest, because they've been to 3 of the meetings, and they just take kind of stakeholder engagement, but they haven't really made a stance. So to come out that strong is wow.
That is hopeful.
It is hopeful. Look, I do think the current administration is trying to really shift public policy towards what it feels is right, while understanding the economic realities and the legislative realities that we live in.
But I think that, and can I just say one last thing for me? I really stress regulation now because I'm really seeing it's the only way we're going to make super rapid change. We're seeing that in India, they said we're no longer allowing flexible plastics for e-commerce. Amazon immediately switched to fiber, like immediately. They did that in the EU as well, whereas in the US, they increased the amount of plastic that they use, right? But for them, because companies don't care about the packaging, they care about the product they're selling. So they're not gonna disrupt their entire profit-making machine just because they can't sell it in plastic anymore, right? So I think if government can really just like have some courage and just make these kind of strong bans, take strong stances, things like caps on virgin production, so we just don't have more coming into the market. Minimum recycled content, the EU is trying to do that. They're saying like you have to put in, I don't know, 30% I think into water bottles. There's a lot of technical difficulty there because there's not enough good supply of food grade, but anyway, that's a whole nother thing too. Limiting polymer blends, we have so many different types of plastics, really hard to recycle. Each type of plastic requires a different model, and not all of them are super easy to recycle. Yeah, harmful chemicals. We didn't even talk about the health impacts, and I'm like, sorry, I know we're closing down, but I'm like getting around
so much.
But like, you know, there was just a study, you probably don't know, there were like 16,000 types of known chemicals in the plastics that we use. That's horrifying. They have been able to identify 5,800 of them, and of that, like, I think 25% of these chemicals are known to be toxic to us, and yet they still keep putting them into the, into the system, and it's like literally crossed into the blood-brain barrier. Like people who have passed away from Alzheimer's, they've done a study, they had 10 times the amount of plastic than people who don't have, who haven't passed away. Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Wow.
Like it's like we are consuming so many microplastics and nanoplastics. I'm sorry to like be the bearer of bad news, but
that's why this matters. That's why.
By the way, speaking of microplastics and the blood-brain barrier, 0.5% of our brain weight right now is microplastics. By the way, 0.5%.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
it affects us.
We're going crazy.
We are
We're going dumb, I think.
I don't know why. On the note of madness, but we would like to open it up and to questions here in the audience, and I'm sure you can bring in other insights along the way. Yeah.
Yes. What I actually realized only now is that like plastic versus carbon has a lot of similarities in terms of how the global discourse has been shaped over the last decades, probably. If you think about carbon, I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but in 2005, actually there was a oil and gas company that brought a campaign out that was focused on consumers, which was like your personal carbon footprint.
Right.
That company was BP.
Yeah.
And why they did that because they actually wanted to distract the attention on company emissions, whereas company emissions is 75 to 80% of global emissions. So we as consumers sure count, but we're only somewhere downstream, right? So I'm curious because on carbon, it seems like the petrochemical companies, oil and gas, kind of losing their grip on the narrative. It sounds like in plastic, they still have quite a strong grip on the global discourse, and they are still able to influence us on so many levels. So I think regulation is something that needs to come, but I'm also curious, like, what do you think on how we can actually influence the global discourse across the world on plastic? And maybe there's some learnings that we can take from how we have influenced like the carbon space. Any thoughts on that?
I have some thoughts.
Great.
Look, it's especially in terms of my work, it's really about like the data, and you really have to address like what's in it for me, or let's like that narrative, as in okay, we understand the numbers. Now we have to like really start quantifying what's happening to you, what's happening to your environment, and quantifying that. As I said, I gave you numbers in terms of 3,000 to 33,000 miles per ton of environmental plastics. Nobody knows those numbers, and it's such a huge, huge range. So how do we quantify that? How do we map that out? I'm starting to work with a organization, a multi-island NGO called Island Conservation, in terms of using data. They have a lot of data in terms of the fishing yields all right, basically mapping out like how much microplastics are in the fish and what it translates to in terms of direct correlation in terms of the fish size, the weights of the fish as an average, and using that microplastics concentration to have a direct correlation with the loss to the economy from basically loss of fish mass. All right, having these numbers, equating it to basically an economic loss, I feel is a great way to essentially, like, you know, basically say, what's in it for me?
I'll wrap up. Oh yeah, I was gonna say, I think more emphasis on the health thing though, that like there's more and more data. I mean, we all kind of know it, but like there's more data, actual quantitative data coming out, and I think as we lean into that, because people at Unilever or whatever, they're like, yeah, I get it, it's kind of an environmental thing, yeah. But like when you say, oh, but your child is literally crawling around on a carpet that's made out of polyester plastics, and they're inhaling that and literally impacting their IQ, literally impacting their chance of having a child later, like that I think strikes people in different ways.
Yes, there's a book called Countdown by Sean, I'm forgetting her name, but it actually correlates directly with chemicals and plastics, endocrine disruptors in plastics that are actually reducing male fertility and sperm counts. So this is fundamentally impacting the future in many ways. And we didn't talk about that here as much, but you're right, public plastics is a public health and human rights issue as well. As we were talking about the issues, the lack of waste management, the labor impacts, it's just, it is a massive cascading effect. What I did want to share though is something that came up in a conversation earlier this week in terms of how can we shift the narrative to the point, and I'm so thrilled actually to hear the US has come out in the context of the treaty negotiations to say we need a cap on plastics, but prior, a lot of industry lobbyists have been really vocal, which is why that treaty hasn't had teeth or as such yet. So what if, as a challenge to corporates, I know some of us work with big corporates in the space, others as well, to actually to be an ocean ally, to be a humanity ally, something that a large corporate could do is actually be a positive force of industry lobbying. And so to use that gravitas and that weight to actually shift the conversation in a way that is bringing pressure and power to the kinds of legislation that we need at the global scale. So that would be a really amazing opportunity and invitation to corporate allies.
I like it.
We have time for one more.
Yeah, I have a quick question for Stan. So the numbers that you mentioned, 3,000 to 33,000 as the true cost of carbon?
Cost of environmental plastics.
Environmental impact. But how do you correlate that with the involuntary markets, like in California, for instance? The polluters that are forced to buy carbon credits, they pay something like $25 a ton. And in the voluntary markets, I mean, the highest transaction that I saw was like 900 something a ton. Like the average might be 300 to 500. So how do you correlate the difference in pricing?
Well,
I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying it doesn't. It seems like it should be higher.
The number that I gave you, it would be great if we had, an equivalency, basically price discovery mechanism for what the market's willing to pay. All right, look, it's what the price is what the market's willing to pay, right? For example, Vera, all right, is the world's one of the world's voluntary carbon market. Basically, they set the standards, right? Vera has launched what's called the plastics credit. It's very, very nascent in the market. And the plastics credits they're pricing plastics credits at probably $150, $160 per ton. I don't know how much.
More or less. I mean,
More or
there's
less.
a huge range. Actually.
Right, there's a huge range.
$50 to $700 at some point.
Right, but basically, again, you're saying, okay, here are the plastic savings that I'm doing per ton, and basically here's the value of that. Now, if nobody's willing to pay for it, as in what's called an offtake partner, willing to get this plastics, let's call it the plastics obligations, off their own balance sheet from their own plastics production, right? I mean, that's essentially what it is. I have carbon, I'm emitting carbon, and it's let's call it a negative asset on my balance sheet. I need to take it off my ledger. So I'm going to buy some offsets, carbon offsets, to offset that, that emission.
Right.
Same thing with plastics. All right, I'm producing a heck of a lot of plastics, but I need to get that obligation off my balance sheet. So I should be paying for a plastics credit and get it off. Well, look, again, what I said about things being grossly undervalued in terms of the environmental damage. Yeah, it would be great if people understood, hey, it costs the environment $3,000 a ton, and if I don't do something about it, that's going to be on my balance sheet. But if I can pay to $160 a ton, $200 a ton, $500 a ton to get it off my balance sheet in terms of my obligation, great, and that money can actually go into financing better projects.
Could you, my understanding of the involuntary market is it's really hard to get into. So if you're like a person that just has financial resources that wants to get involved to purchase credits, it's really hard to get into it. But if the market were deeper, right, and people believe the numbers that you were saying, and they started speculating on the price of carbon, that would drive the price way up, and then the polluters would have to pay more.
Yeah, you're talking about basically having a market for it, as in basically you have providers and you have essentially, you have sellers and you have buyers in terms of basically, let's call it a commodity, right? And then you have speculators that can come in and speculate on the movement of the market. We don't have that kind of market and price discovery mechanism right now, which I think will be great. Some basically I think a couple of we have JP Morgan and all that kind of stuff, trying to build those kind of markets, because I do think a price discovery mechanism is necessary and a market-based mechanism is necessary. But the issue is a carbon credit, a carbon offset generated here is not necessarily equal to a carbon credit generated somewhere else. There is a problem of what's called additionality and co-benefits as well. How do you value a carbon credit that you're generating in Africa, where it's empowering women to have jobs, where it's providing biodiversity, or all of these other factors. Whereas hey, I'm just reducing my emissions over here. It's a I don't think the market is perfected. That is, I believe that is the way to do it in terms of figuring out price discovery mechanism to actually build in, so we can actually have appreciation for what I consider something. It is something that is going to appreciate in the future, for sure. And you see that in Europe, where basically the value of the carbon is actually being driven up quite a bit over the last few years.
I know that the next team is here, so maybe we'll do one more question and then we'll have some wrap up and next steps from our side. Is there one more question?
I don't have a question, but I want to add to what you guys said, and prompted me to do some more research around this, and I will, and hopefully we'll share it with you later. But what you're saying, that the marketplace is being built by the World Bank now. Last year, in December last year, the new president of the World Bank came, Ajay Banga, who used to be the president of MasterCard, who understands that you cannot push the taxpayers in the West to pay for there's no way that you can win an election by saying your taxpayer money is going to help with carbon credit removal in Senegal. That's not happening. So this suggestion is we as an institution, we need to undertake this and facilitate the voluntary carbon credit market. And I know from my experience, they're really trying their best to put it out there. I don't know the details of it. I'm trying to do quick research. But I do think there are solutions. And the theme that the last week that I spent here, I love that we talk about problems and we amplify the problems. I always try to bring in the solutions and invite people to research, add, demand, ask, and get involved. So I wanted to put it that way.
I don't want to build a new bread, but carbon and plastic credits are different slightly, and
Yeah.
plastic credits is very nascent. I was part of the bureaus as they set up the first global plastics credit market. I was pilot with them. There is huge need for it and for companies who are based in the global south because we really struggle to get financing, but it's been challenging to get it started. So I'd like to see the evolution of it. Yeah, anyway.
Or, yeah, the integrity and what it's serving. Yeah, but especially for labor
Well,
dignity. And
It's more that Vera wants to only be a standard, but they don't want to connect the market together. And that's because it's such a nascent market, you need to connect the buyers and sellers together, and they're not willing to do that. So it's been, not successful because of that, honestly. Yeah.
Well, on the note of action, I think that's actually how I wanted to wrap up here, because I know we did talk about how broken the system is, how recycling is not working. I think to the title of the panel is recycling a host. For plastic recycling, yes, this is a host. But we didn't mention other materials, so other materials paper and aluminum, I would say, especially paper, cardboard. There are robust markets for those materials around the world, so largely that is a successful recycling stream. But just to wrap up on that question, I think regarding plastics, from our perspective at Oceanic Global, we always advocate for reusable systems, for bringing your own reusable, but also for creating municipal-wide reusable systems. And there are pilots that are ongoing around this, actually in New York City and elsewhere around the world. There's quite a few in Europe. But having reusable takeaway containers, you've worked with Deliver to Zero or seen whatever city you live in, you might have reusable coffee cups or takeaway containers. And when we buy into those systems, even though they're clunky and maybe expensive and slow at the start, we are supporting and feeding into bringing that reality into the world we want to live in. And ultimately, those are the best solutions. Also for events. Within hospitality and tourism too, just thinking through avoiding the need for disposables and therefore recycling infrastructure, especially around plastic, since we know it's not working. So I did just want to end with that in terms of a direct call to action and how you can be a part of that revolution. And then pass it to our panelists for any final notes you want to say, and call to action or something that's giving you hope that you're excited about.
Look, I mean, I'm hopeful. There have been some great conversations. I'm glad the world is convening around New York for Climate Week, right? I'm very happy about that. I've had some great conversations with actual, plastics producers around tracking and tracing at this point. When I built my recycling blockchain, basically, I launched it 6 years ago, and now the conversations are starting. Right? Now there's interest. I'm like, okay, all right, I feel you're a few years too late, but maybe I was a little too early. Who knows?
Right on time.
Yeah. You think be a loud, conscious consumer. So if you're, choosing more sustainable options, tell your friends why. All my friends are like, oh, we would hate that we're using plastic. So I'm incepted into their mind about it. Investors, please, I would love to see more financing into hardware tech, deep tech, infrastructure. That's what's really lacking. Policymakers, be courageous, and take the bold step that we need. Don't give in to the lobbyists who outnumbered some of the smallest delegates at the UN meeting. Just frightening, right? Yeah. Anyway. Okay, and thank you so much for your attention because I know it's really late. It's Friday. It's in the evening.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's
That was very simple. Thank you guys. Thanks for taking the time to share.
I don't think it's on.
Thank you guys. Can we give them another round of applause?